Tonight, after decades of work and billions of dollars spent to improve conditions in the Chesapeake Bay, is it time for a course correction? With a cleanup deadline looming in 2025, that's next year, the watershed will fall short of many of its goals. Runoff from cities and farm fields continues to exceed set limits. Tree cover is declining, the population is growing rapidly, and communities of color are often left out of the conversation. Our panel of experts will grapple with why progress has been so slow and what's next.
Not meeting the goal isn't the failure. The failure would be if we didn't learn how to do it better.
We got to get people engaged and passionate about their local watersheds.
The things that people need make the most impact.
I'll pay a visit to a local waterway that has an interesting story to tell.
Why are we seeing increases in best management practices and
also seeing increases in the pollutants? We'll discuss what it means to restore the bay in the face of a warming climate and tough trade-offs. All that coming up on the 2024 Chesapeake Bay Summit. Good evening. I'm your host, Frank Sesno. Tonight's program takes place just over 40 years after the signing of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. This simple one-page document acknowledged the decline of living resources in the nation's largest estuary, this beautiful place, and it launched a multi-state federal partnership, the Chesapeake Bay Program, tasked with handling cleanup. But 4 decades in, we haven't come as far as we'd hoped or even expected. The people joining us tonight represent different facets of an ongoing difficult conversation about the path to progress. They understand the complexity of the watershed restoration, science and policy. They care deeply about the health of the bay and its rivers. Our first guest tonight is Adam Ortiz, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Adam oversees federal environmental and public health protections across 5 states, the District of Columbia, and 7 federally recognized tribes. Denise Wardrop is Executive Director for the Chesapeake Research Consortium, an association of 7 research and education institutions in the Chesapeake watershed, a renowned scientist and engineer specializing in wetlands ecology and hydrology. She's also a professor of geography at Penn State University. Carmera Thomas-Wilhite is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. She leads the efforts to increase diverse voices engaged in advocacy for clean water in the Bay watershed. Joining us from a bit farther out in the watershed is David Sly, Conservation Director for the nonprofit Wild Virginia. David has spent more than 40 years fighting for the enforcement of environmental laws. Previously, he served as a senior environmental engineer for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And finally, Carl Blankenship, co-founder and editor-at-large of the Chesapeake Bay Journal. He's been reporting on Bay cleanup policies for more than 30 years. And speaking of the Bay Journal, it is our very esteemed partner in this initiative. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Look forward to that conversation. We will hear from our guests in just a minute. But first, let's take a look at how the Chesapeake has changed over the centuries to get to where it is today. At nearly 200 miles long, the Chesapeake Bay is North America's largest estuary. Its tidal expanse fed by fresh water from more than 100,000 streams, creeks, and rivers, some hundreds of miles from the bay proper. Today, more than 18 million people in 6 states and the District of Columbia live on land that drains into the Chesapeake. Our impact on these local landscapes directly affects the waters downstream. When John Smith made his famous Bay voyage in 1608, some 40 to 50,000 native people were living along its shores, harvesting its bounty of fish and shellfish. Early British settlers and enslaved Africans arrived to virgin forests and clean waters. But by 1900, human activity had begun to diminish the watershed's natural systems. Deforestation depleted the region of 70 to 80% of its tree cover, allowing more and more sediment to erode into waterways. Overfishing caused harvests of oysters, an important filter feeder, to decline and later plummet. After World War II came industrialized agriculture and rapid population growth. More livestock and more people meant more pollution. Fertilizer and manure from farm fields, car exhaust, sewage discharge, household chemicals, all carrying nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus downstream. And without those trees or oysters to provide natural filtration, these nutrients began feeding large algal blooms that depleted oxygen and created dead zones, suffocating marine life. In 1972, the passage of the Clean Water Act empowered the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency to regulate pollution and water quality standards. In 1983, the EPA, along with Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, signed the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, acknowledging shared responsibility to address the bay's declining health. Since then, billions have been spent on studying and cleaning up the bay, but with participation voluntary, progress was slow. Which is why in 2010 the EPA exercised its authority under the Clean Water Act and put the watershed on a pollution diet, a set of regulations to limit and reduce, over time, the amount of nutrients that can escape into the bay. Officially, it's known as the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, and it comes with a deadline. By 2025, all practices to meet water quality standards are to be in place. In 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement set additional goals, establishing concrete outcomes needed to achieve an environmentally and economically sustainable watershed, with abundant life, conserved lands, engaged communities, climate resiliency, and clean water. It too set a deadline, 2025. Strides have been made. Wastewater treatment plants are polluting less, and large-scale oyster restoration projects are showing promise. But the watershed at large will fall short on many of the 2025 goals, from water quality to wetland, to the diversity of voices in the cleanup conversation. What's more, a recent landmark study has called both our current course and expectations about restoration into question. And here is that report. It's called A Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response, or CESAR. It's an imposing title with a hefty message. An assessment by the Bay Program's Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee of our progress toward water quality standards. More than 60 experts weighed in for this report. Now, as we just heard, we're not going to be meeting all those standards, nor many of the other 2025 goals. So, to our discussion now, and Denise, first to you, because you're co-editor of this report, right?
Right.
What's the bottom line here? What went wrong?
I don't think it's a question of what went wrong. I think there are three themes in the report that it talks about. One is that not because for lack of trying, but it's become much more challenging than we ever thought it would be. So we thought our investments that we were making would have a greater return than they have. There's reasons for that. The second thing is that the Bay of the future is not the Bay of the past. And I know we're going to talk about that, but we can't return to a historical precedent. The world is changing. And the third point the report makes is that there are opportunities to improve the effectiveness of what we're doing, but it's going to take some significant change in policies and programs.
I have the report right here, and there's a line that's really striking, and it says the Chesapeake Bay program has estimated that 27% of the Bay area met water quality standards in 1985. By 2020, it says that figure had only risen to the mid-30% range. Can you explain that? What happened?
Well, I think that you look at the headwinds with, we weren't only pursuing water quality during that time, and I think your video highlighted that. There's been a tremendous amount, there's been multiple objectives, right, to the watershed during that same time. It wasn't just improving water quality, it was adding 6 million more residents and places for them to live. It was intensifying agriculture on less and less agricultural land. All those things were happening at the same time we were pursuing. It's amazing to me the line is going up, that we've made progress against those headwinds.
So, Carl, there is progress, but there are obviously these places where we've fallen significantly short. So what should we make? What should the public make of what seem to be mixed messages about our progress with the Bay?
Well, it's a really more difficult job, I think, than a lot of people originally thought. And it's just going to be, it's something you have to keep, and I think this is kind of one of the things that came out of CESAR. You have to do experimentation. It just takes a lot of work, and this is going to be a long slog. It's not to give up, but if we just keep working at it, plugging away, figure out what works, we can make progress.
Adam, EPA, it's your job. You see progress, you see problems. What's most significant to you?
Well, there's a lot to build on, and the results have been mixed, but basically we've taken care of what's called point sources. So that's pipes, pollution coming out of pipes like wastewater treatment plants and factories. We pretty much got that under control pretty quickly as we expected. What's tougher is the non-point stuff. So this is pollution that comes from more general areas, and we're talking stormwater runoff from urban areas, and that's thousands of millions of properties and property owners and also farms. Here in the Mid-Atlantic region, it's not like the West where you have these big, huge commodity farms. They're mostly historical small family farms, and there's 80,000 of them. So that's, what Denise is talking about. Some of this stuff is a little bit tougher than we expected. But, every iteration, and your video did a great job of this, we level up. So we've leveled up every decade or two, stepped up our game, and now that 2025 is coming, we're going to work together to step up our game again.
I think it's really important to emphasize and make sure people understand, we understand what you just said between point and non-point sources, just to understand. Point sources is a specific place, wastewater treatment plant. You can go there and you can change, adjust what's coming out of it. Non-point is like everything else, all the vast area that's represented in this watershed and the land that leads to the flow into it, right? I mean, like you said, farms, cities, roads.
Yeah, it's big stuff. So most of us, travel around, go to the shopping center, get on the bus, drive someplace. All that is non-point. Those are, often uncontrolled places where water's coming down and taking the pollution into the closest storm drain, and that's a big area, as we know.
David, we hear about these things and missed deadlines and all the rest, and I'm wondering how you process that and whether you think this has sparked a change in the conversation around cleaning up the bay.
Yeah, I think, first of all, the Caesar report said some really important things, one of which is that the predictions on how well these corrective actions, these management practices would work just haven't necessarily worked out that way. And, we talk about best management practices, BMPs, all the time. Fact is that the practices aren't necessarily the best in specific circumstances. We need to figure out what is the best for a construction site, for a farm, for a place where we're applying sewage sludge to farms. In each of those places, in each of those activities, the activity or the standard for what's good enough, we have to figure that out, and we have to do more monitoring so we know.
And you have to engage the people in those communities. Is there more that needs to be done there?
Absolutely, and frankly, as we described, this is a huge watershed, and there are a ton of people out there who may never even think about the bay. They like oysters maybe, but they're not necessarily on a daily basis talking about the Chesapeake Bay, but they care about the stream in their backyard that runs through their park, where they fish and where they swim. And they need to be involved in their specific place and helping come up with those solutions.
Carmera, thinking about people who need to come up with those solutions and participate in this, part of your focus is to bring more people into it.
Yeah.
And bring more diversity into that conversation.
That's right.
Why is that so important?
Yeah, I think the science is really important, but the people who are on the front lines in the forefront of the experiences and the place-based knowledge are just as important. So having different voices, different people with those perspectives, they're experts as well because of their rooted life experiences.
So where are you working? Who are you trying to engage and how?
Yeah, so we're working all over the watershed, but in particular, smaller farmers and cities. We're working with community members who are dealing with extreme flooding. They might not know it's sea level rise, but they know that there's street floods and their cars floating down the road, but they're experiencing that. They're experiencing flooding and those things that come along with climate change and pollution, but they just don't have that vocabulary to name it, but they know what that means and what they're experiencing and how it might affect where they live and how they get to work and things like that.
Denise is co-editor of this report, looking at the science, but hearing the conversation about the people. Could you talk about that and how we bring more people into this conversation? Because we're going to need them if we're going to get action.
Right, and I think they've already talked about 2 points. I mean, I think one is it's not only, there's a reason we need the highest possible diversity of solutions at the table, right? Because not meeting the goal isn't the failure. The failure would be if we didn't learn how to do it better, right? And basically engage everybody. So I think the other point is that local makes sense. I mean, exactly right, what's in your backyard is what matters. Maybe the bay is the co-benefit, but what you're really concerned about is what's happening in your local area.
Adam, I asked a moment ago about how this has changed the conversation. You're at the EPA. It's the EPA that's responsible for the regulations that are supposed to lead to this cleanup. How has this changed the conversation from your perspective and from your agency's perspective?
Well, EPA is on the team, and we have some authorities, but we don't have control over like local land use, and things like that are more localized. So we really need the states to step up as well as local communities. And over the 40 years of the agreement, there's been times where some states have really stepped up and accelerated, but others have fallen back. So, in the Biden administration, we've had a tough love approach to make sure that we're making sure that the states are engaging and stepping up. At the same time, we've been delivering historic amounts of funds and technical assistance to places from farmers and rural communities to urban places as well, including the city of Baltimore. But, to the point, to the conversation that we're having now, we got to get people engaged and passionate about their local watersheds, that even if you don't live near the bay, you're part of the watershed and you relate to your neighborhood, you relate to your local stream, and that people are empowered and weighing in, not just with EPA, but also with their local leaders and state leaders to make sure that we're doing everything we can on Team Chesapeake to clean it up.
So speaking of that local stream, I went to one. We've been talking big picture, so I want to zoom in now to a single tributary. The Chesapeake River on Maryland's eastern shore is one place where our expectations about nutrient pollution haven't lined up with reality. Across the watershed, planning and policies are often driven by predictions of how the land, water, and air will respond to changes in land use, climate, and pollutants. Scientists are able to make these predictions thanks to computer models, mathematical representations of complex real-world ecosystems. For the Chesapeake River on the Delmarva Peninsula, the model tells us that if we applied best management practices to reduce runoff, like stream buffers and cover crops, then nutrient pollution in the Chesapeake will go down. And so, for decades, area farmers have been doing just that. But is it playing out as the model predicted? I met up with environmental scientist Kyoto Silophone on a rainy day when we could see the water running from the land right into the river just upstream of Greensboro, Maryland. You've been studying this river for 10 years. Why?
Well, so the Chesapeake River is one of the main tributaries flowing into the Chesapeake Bay. This area here, the headwaters of the Chesapeake River, it's been monitored by USGS since the mid-60s. So it's got this very long, good record of nitrogen and phosphorus.
So what you've seen and what you've been able to measure is essentially a gap between the modeling and the monitoring, what we've seen here.
Yeah, so the Bay model considers all of the best management practices that are being applied in the headwaters. And it suggests nitrogen and phosphorus are decreasing, and they have decreased since 1985.
But the monitoring tells a different story. Each month, the United States Geological Survey collects water samples at 123 non-tidal sites throughout the Chesapeake watershed, including here. They measure nutrient levels when it's calm and during storm flows. Since 1965, both nitrogen and phosphorus have been trending up at Greensboro.
So why are we seeing increases in best management practices? And
also seeing increases in the pollutants.
right. So with modeling, right now there's a lot of good data going into it, right? But there are also some assumptions. We assume that cover crops are very efficient in intercepting nitrogen.
But perhaps, Silophone says, they're not as efficient as the model assumes. Another consideration, the intensification of agriculture.
The poultry industry has grown exponentially over the years.
And that industry produces, in addition to chickens, a lot of
Manure, exactly. The amount of farmland hasn't increased that much, so you're simply applying more of that manure to a limited amount of farmland.
What's the significance of this gap, of this disparity?
A lot of policies are based on what the model is showing. I think overall we're trending in the right direction for the bay. Right? It's little pockets like this where I think it shows us that we just have some more questions. We have some unknowns and we need to figure out what else do we need to do with this model, or actually on the ground, to move the needle in the right direction.
We stood out there in the rain for a lot longer than we have time to show you here tonight. Mostly we stayed dry, but you can watch an extended version of that conversation. It's quite fascinating online at mpt.org/Bay Summit. Adam, Denise, Carl, this is a really interesting example, a sort of snapshot where the modeling and the monitoring are different, discrepancies, significant discrepancies. What does that tell us, and do we see that a lot throughout the watershed?
Well, I can say in the model predicts in the 9 major tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay that, for example, phosphorus should have been going down in almost all of them. And in fact, phosphorus is going up in 6 out of the 9.
It's going up in 6 out of the 9.
Yeah.
Now, does that surprise you?
Well, sure. So you want to know why. And I think the model is important. The model gave everyone an even accountability system, right? And a model pretty much combines everything we know, but it operates at a spatial scale that doesn't match what actually happens on the ground. And there's these, Carl can be quite articulate about this, about what we call mass imbalances, where are these pots of nutrients that are continuing to contribute no matter what we do.
All right, Carl, you're invited to be quite articulate.
Well, yeah, the economics of agriculture basically force a lot of very intense agriculture, usually animal agriculture, into very, fairly geographically restricted areas, and you just end up with more manure than the land can handle, as they said in that segment. And it's just a very difficult question because the economics really force that. When you talk to farmers and when you talk to companies, the market competition's so intense, there's not a lot of margin for increasing costs or anything. And
so it's the market competition, it's the market that's driving this?
That is a huge driver in agriculture. Yeah, and it's very hard to overcome that.
Adam.
So a few different things. One, we have fewer farmers every decade. We have more people to feed every decade. So the intensification is a big deal. On the model, it's a pretty young model. So if we think about a model we're all familiar with, weather forecasting, it's been 200 years since we built on Ben Franklin's first weather model. It's pretty good nowadays. So this is a pretty good model, but we know it's not always perfect. There's another watershed upstream, the western branch of the Susquehanna, which actually shows the opposite trend from what we see in the chop tank. In the chop tank, it overestimated the progress, but in that watershed, it underestimated the progress. And overall, and we've recently done an assessment in partnership with our scientists, we find that on average, the model's just about right. But there are sort of these outliers and skews, and the chop tank is one of them, and we need to figure that out. Another point I wanted to make is, we're in a federal system here, as we were talking about earlier, and the Bay program and the partnership is the most federal of the federal programs among them that we have at EPA in partnership with the states. So when it comes to farming, and I said earlier, this is the tough stuff, the small farms. EPA only has regulatory authority over 2% of farms.
2%.
2%. The rest is up to the states.
David, you talk to farmers, you know them, live with them. If somebody were with us now, he or she would say, do you know what it's like to be doing the job that I'm doing and to be up against nature and everything else? And now you're going to impose burdens on me because way downstream, maybe some of this manure ends up out there. What does that conversation sound like?
I'll say yes, I understand that it's a hard life. It's not one that I would probably be very good at. You're subject to so many vagaries of weather and all kinds of other things. At the same time, I'd say we're not choosing to impose something upon you. I'll tell you that the Clean Water Act, again, 51 years ago, as you said in your piece, that set what we're supposed to be doing here. And there are actually in place already permitting systems and regulations that, frankly, the states, in my case, the state of Virginia, the permits requirements that they're imposing on things like land application of animal waste don't meet the requirements of the Clean Water Act. And the fact is that we've got to fix that. And yes, it is a burden on the farmers. And yes, we can figure out how to help them, but we can't ignore those problems. And I'm not just telling those folks worry about the bay. I'm telling them worry about the Shenandoah River, where every year you have horrible algae explosions in certain areas.
Carmela, you mentioned earlier that you are talking to farmers too. Sure. How do we close this gap between what's happening and what needs to happen if we're going to address this huge problem that ends up in the water?
Yeah, well, people are smart when they make the connection between what they're doing on their farm and the science behind it, and having that awareness and education, that really makes a difference. So really having farmers talking to farmers, folks who can make that connection and know what they're dealing with, really helps bring in those voices and those perspectives. So awareness, education, and having smaller groups connect with them and make that interconnection about what they're dealing with and the science behind what's actually happening on the ground.
So literally, what do you say to them?
We say the bottom line. The economics are really important to farmers. They want to know how much they're going to make that year. They want to know how much money they're spending.
But do you say stop using manure, or stop using so much, or use this instead?
So it's a little different in each state too. So they're in Maryland in particular. I can speak to that. There are farmers that are fencing their cows out of the stream. They're putting in stream crossings for them. They're putting stream buffers in that help some of that erosion control. But we're talking to them about what those practices look like and how that can save them money.
Adam.
So farmers have not been at the table, and I think the environmental movement has to make more of an effort going forward than we have historically to engage farmers. My very first in-person meeting in this job, and I've been in this job for about 2.5 years, was with the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. And I drove to their office in Harrisburg, sat in their paneled conference room. Their board of directors and staff was there, and I said, hey, we got to work together more. And I'm under a lot of pressure here, as you're putting on me in this discussion, Frank, which is great and important. But we need to figure out how to control runoff from farms and other sectors. And the response I got back from the president of the Farm Bureau was, we agree. And that gentleman, President Rick Ebert, said, I'm a no-till farmer. I've been a conservationist my whole life, and most farmers are. What's missing, Adam, is that farmers don't get the support from states and the federal government that other sectors do.
Meaning financial support? Is that what that's all about?
Yeah, so we put billions of dollars into wastewater treatment plants, and the technology is very clear, and we figured that out. We have not made a similar investment into farms, especially small farms, where the economics are tougher and it's a little more complex.
Well, and I would say that the way we try to incentivize farmers, we need to reflect on that and revisit if that's working. We ask them to volunteer, and we say, we'll share, we'll cost share with you. Well, that doesn't negate the fact that some of these things are large upfront cost, right? And not all of them have private benefits to the farmer. So we're asking a farmer to do some capital outlay for something that they don't get any benefits out of. And so I think that we have to look at how we incentivize people to engage.
There's that word people again. We talk about nitrogen and we talk about phosphorus, but people.
Yeah,
Carmela.
I think Adam made a really great point. Just making that relationship and authenticity and showing up and being in their space. I think that's how you bring in diverse voices, because you're holding yourself accountable to listen, to hear what they're dealing with, their perspective. Maybe the regulation isn't something that they need at that point, but how can they be a part of the decision making to change that and really get the feedback that they need and the results that they need and the solutions.
And
so
Carl, are we
partnerships.
taking advantage of the watershed communities themselves, learning from them, engaging them, or is that part two of the post-2025 strategy here if we're going to make progress?
Well, I think when you are talking, at least in the farming context, there hasn't been very good outreach historically. I think that started to improve. But that's just going to be a very difficult challenge, and that gets back to those economic, our federal state market pressures are to produce more to keep farmers viable. Farming is a very nutrient-intense operation. You do not grow food without nutrients, and crops tend to lose a lot of nutrients, even under good management. And we've spent about $3 billion on various programs for agricultural control since the TMDL went into place. And it's not clear that we're making a lot of progress. We're holding the line. We may be making a little bit of progress, but that's a very difficult, society has very different goals. We want those farms, but we want clean water. And that's a very difficult question. And
David?
I just wanted to say one other thing farmers tell me is, why are you picking on me and why aren't you focusing on that construction project over there, that city that's
Fair point.
dumping all kinds of stuff off of the streets?
Fair point.
And absolutely, it's a fair point. And here again, frankly, we're not stepping up on those aspects either. The state of Virginia in 2017 produced an assessment that said 39% of all the stream miles in Virginia are affected by sedimentation. Not just muddy water, but sediment that is affecting the habitats, that is hurting the biological life there. A lot of that comes from construction projects.
Carmera, I want to come back to you on the conversation with farmers and ask you that, because I had a fascinating conversation with a Maryland farmer not long ago who talked about, because the rains have changed, reberming his property, changing the way his property drained to address issues of runoff. So it's not just what you put on the land, but how you mold the land and what you do with the land. Is that a conversation that you have had? Is that something that is happening and is going to need to happen more because of the changing world that we're in?
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, everything that happens upstream also comes downstream, so it's not their fault, that happens, and we can't control the weather or the heavy rain and storms like that, but just having that conversation to be prepared for that, and adapting some of those solutions to compete with the climate change and the heavy rains and more intense storms that we will be seeing for the future. When
you have that conversation, have you found that a lot of farmers have either made those sorts of changes or are now contemplating those changes? Because there's cost associated with that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think having conversations about what those costs are, and them being a part of what they need and having that feedback. But I think they understand what the issue is, but having that conversation around, what they can do and how they can work with local government, federal, their state agencies, other farmers who are doing other things. A lot of our programs are talking, farmer to farmer, so they're hearing what's happening on their neighbor's farm, so they're able to make adaptations in that way. I really think, the cost benefits of doing those things is not just great for, the water quality and the farm, but it's also great for them. They end up having more money, in their pocket after they put in some of those practices.
Denise, from the reports, the Caesar report again, thinking again about this kind of runoff, phosphorus and nitrogen, and what needs to be done. What is the future course, knowing that this is so difficult and that we haven't made our goals to date and won't for 2025? What does the future suggest?
Well, I think that what the Caesar report tried to do was, more than anything else, point out the opportunities for improved effectiveness. And there are a couple. One is targeting, right? Probably 80% of the load comes from 20% of the farm land.
Really?
And so, yeah. And so how do we
let's say that again. 80% of the load comes from 20% of the farm
probably
land.
comes from 20%, right, around that. And so we don't target now, right? Voluntary. And who normally volunteers are people where the load isn't so great already. They're early adopters. And so if we could target where we went, that would make a difference. We have talk about incentives. So let's pay for outcomes, not just the number of BMPs you installed, because people teach to the test, right?
BMP's best management practices.
Best management practices, sorry. But, we do, if we paid them for outcomes, they'd go looking for the problem areas, which would be much more effective.
Okay, so as we've heard, cleaning up the bay has proved to be much harder than we thought. And it seems to be getting even more challenging. As we take steps toward a healthier bay watershed, major headwinds threaten to derail our progress. Climate change, the intensification of agriculture, population growth.
Population in the Chesapeake Bay region has more than doubled since 1950. We're going to top 20 million within the next decade. You have to deal with more wastewater, more development. We've been adding impervious surface, meaning buildings and pavement, at the rate of about 50,000 acres every 5 years.
When it rains, these impervious surfaces channel runoff into storm drains, sending pollutants on a fast track to the bay. And more people demand more food from the region's farmers. But farming costs are on the rise.
Farmers are under incredible pressure, not just from development, but from finances. If a farmer is required or their crop requires a certain set of equipment, a certain set of nutrients, a certain type of labor, and that labor, that equipment, that material is in short supply, prices go up. And if you're operating as a farmer in one of the low margin crops, corn or wheat or soy, it can be extremely detrimental.
Farmers offset shrinking profit margins by producing more food on the same land, which means more fertilizer and more manure. And then there's climate change. Since 1995, the average summer water temperature in the Chesapeake has increased by about 1.8 degrees. This trend has heavily offset the work to improve conditions in the bay. We've reduced nutrient pollution with the goal of increasing dissolved oxygen and shrinking the bay's dead zone. But warmer waters hold less oxygen. Both in the bay itself and in the streams and rivers of the watershed, species that are sensitive to heat are declining: eelgrass, brook trout, striped bass. There's another potential problem. Warm waters could increase the toxicity of heavy metals and promote bacterial growth, contributing to public health issues. Bay waters are also rising, and that's projected to continue 1.3 to 5.2 feet over the next century, leading to shoreline erosion and coastal flooding. Cities like Baltimore, Annapolis, and Norfolk have already felt the effects, as have low-lying rural communities. Increased precipitation, another consequence of climate change, creates more runoff and more flooding. With water levels already high, storm surges can be devastating. In both urban and rural areas, low-income communities and communities of color are often disproportionately affected by flooding, heat waves, and other climate-related impacts. As a result of cleanup efforts across the watershed, we've held the line on many fronts. But the pressures and threats are real. New strategies, technologies, and thinking are needed to expedite progress toward a healthier bay in the future. New ways of thinking are needed. So we've talked a little bit about this. We also talked about, because there's some pretty rough stuff out there, there are areas to give us some hope. There is some progress. Can we just pause for a minute and hover on that, and then we'll come back to climate change and all of this? What is hopeful about what's happening?
Well, people are more engaged than ever, so that's a good thing. The generation that's coming up now are majoring in environmental science, things that we didn't, that weren't available to me and maybe not you, but we're seeing oysters doing well, we're seeing blue crabs doing well, and we're seeing, overall people participating in their local waterways.
Carl, you've been covering this for a long time. Where's the good news out there right now?
Yeah, there is
Pause.
good news out there. and although some people on this very panel think I'm kind of a gloomy person, there actually is.
Oh, there's plenty to be gloomy about.
Yeah, though the nutrient trends may not be positive, some of the BMP's best management practices have definitely shown improvements for streams. I can show you many places where streams have improved and been taken off the dirty waters list because of those BMPs. And
so Denise? Good news? What if you from this report, what is the one thing that would really stand out if somebody stopped you on the street and said, show me where there's been the most progress? I think,
well, I have two things. I'm going to cheat. One is that the dead zone, the size of the dead zone is decreasing. That's huge. That was started the whole thing. But I think for me, it's looking at the amount that we've learned. We've learned an incredible amount about what works, what doesn't work, where to put things, how to do things better. That's incredibly hopeful to me.
Carmela and David, everybody wants a healthier bay. Everybody wants a vibrant economy. We want food that we can afford, as we talked about before. And we're continuing to grow. Are all these forces completely at odds?
No, I think there's an intersection of all of those things. I mean, the social piece, the economic, the environment, and I think what makes me hopeful is that there are people that are being heard, and more organizations and federal agencies are listening to those diverse voices. So they're part of the solution, which is really exciting, because the communities that have been dealing with some of these issues for decades are finally being, part of the implementation and the solutions.
And you're seeing real traction there?
I am. I'm, behavior change and some of the tangible things that you can see, like trash and people being involved. Yeah, we're seeing that a lot. Young people, like Adam mentioned, definitely.
David.
Well, yeah, I think involvement from folks. We work a lot on advocacy, and we work on bringing people in to work beside us in advocacy, to make, to represent their interest in the things they see need to be done. One of the things I think that is kind of balances out some of these concerns about the economics is that if people can understand that doing it better now will save them money down the road. Putting in green infrastructure, doing things that are more natural, keeps you from having to build that concrete structure to handle the flow coming off the streets. So people need to understand better that it's an investment that will pay off because you won't face some of those problems farther down the road.
So we're talking about people, we're talking about advocacy, we're talking about the future. So let's take a question from someone who will live the future and have been experiencing it. Noel Welday is a student at Bowie State University in Maryland.
Knowing what we do about pollution, overharvesting, and climate change, is it possible to revert the Chesapeake to what it once was? How do we explain to the people what we mean when we talk about restoring the bay?
What a great question. Can we restore the bay? And how do we talk to people about restoring the bay? David, you want us to kick that off?
As a longtime devotee of the Clean Water Act, I'll go back to what it says. It said we were going to work to restore and maintain our waters, but what it talks about is the integrity of these systems. We're not going to go back to John Smith's time. We would be delusional if we thought that was going to be the case. What we need is these water bodies to work as aquatic systems that support the wildlife and the species, and support the things that we want and need to do with these waters. So it's, do they function? Do they work?
Carmera, how would you answer Noel's question?
Yeah, I think it's about revitalizing the bay, not necessarily restoration, not going backwards, but moving forward. And because we have, a diversity of voices that can be incorporated into the science and the place-based knowledge, I think we will see that, as people learn more and are more engaged. And I think that, like David said, the things that people need make the most impact. We need to make sure that we're being equitable and have holistic solutions that meet all people's needs, not just the organization or the government or what the waterway says.
There's a very serious amount of focus now, and it's something that you spend a lot of time on. I know you do too, Adam, on environmental justice and making sure that more people are engaged in this. So when you think about revitalizing versus restoring, what does that mean for underserved communities?
Yeah. I mean, the acknowledgement first that communities, BIPOC communities, low income, are disproportionately impacted by impacts of pollution, by climate change, knowing that the solutions need to make the most impact in the places that need it most. So just making sure we have that awareness first and foremost, that internal discussion with the organizations, and then also working with communities who are on the front lines and who are already engaged in community advocacy. They already have been a part of these conversations for decades.
So Adam, over to you. The EPA actually is granting funds to address environmental justice or injustice issues. How is that being applied to watershed communities, to kind of communities that Carmera is dealing with, talking to?
Well, there's historic funding and to help communities build capacity.
So what does that mean?
So we have new programs across the charts going to communities to help them have some staff and have some time to be able to go to meetings. So if you think about it, it's usually the wealthiest communities where people retire early, they were attorneys, or that have the time to show up to our meetings or advocate. Working class communities, people are working. They're raising families, they don't have time to do that stuff. So to support those local organizations, but importantly, Frank, what we're doing in the Biden administration is we're going to them. So these are groups that didn't always have representation electorally, that were marginalized racially or economically. So we're going to those communities, to their tables to listen. And we've been Sparrows Point, Turner Station neighborhood, working with them on resilience. South Baltimore, prone to flooding, lots of environmental justice communities there, as well as the Eastern Shore.
But it's nice to go and listen. What are you actually doing? I mean, if underserved communities are disproportionately hurt by this, what are you actually doing now that's different, that's helping?
Well, there's a few different things. One, we know that there's contaminants and problems that have been neglected for a long time. So in this Sparrows Point area, we're dredging up and cleaning up just decades of toxic material that's been sitting there from the steel days. So that's a big deal. Shoreline resilience to help communities not flood. So that's a big focus in Crisfield on the Eastern Shore. So that hard stuff, but also when you show up to communities that are disadvantaged, it's not just one or two things, it's like 7 or 8 or 9 or 20 things that they're dealing with historically. So we have to listen to their local wisdom, as you said, things that have been neglected, and also use our role as a federal partner. Can't regulate everything, can't enforce everything, but we can also bring in state or local partners or even philanthropy to help solve those problems. But you got to show up, you got to listen to the people that have not been listened to historically.
Carl, if you're writing the story about revitalizing rather than restoring, how's that narrative change? How does that story change?
I think it's trying to have continual improvements and have tangible goals where you can show that things actually improved, whether it's oysters in the bay, healthier streams in the system, and be able to make steady progress. I think sometimes our impatience has worked against us. When we set aggressive goals, then it sets us up for defeat. It causes people to point fingers. But I think if we have goals where people actually see results that are tangible to them, I think that would help a lot.
So Denise, let's talk a little bit about targeting, something you raised before, focusing on shallow waters and some of the particulars now about how we move this thing forward.
Yeah, and I think I love the term revitalization. I think restoration sets up these false expectations. The definition, right, of revitalization is imbue with new life or vitality. And I think that there's a conversation that we need to be headed to. That's, what does vitality mean to all of us? And that requires a diverse set of voices to have that visioning. And it also, just it's going to require a diverse set of solutions. We've got to learn to experiment and fast fail, and it's okay, as long as we're moving forward. So I think the Caesar report talks about focusing on shallow waters for these restoration efforts for a number of reasons. One is it's where the living resources are, it's where the people are, it's where we interact with the resource.
What does that mean, shallow waters, just so everybody understands? Is that coastal areas, is that particular bodies of water, just so we're clear?
It's all the edges of the bay, all the way up into the watershed, and those nearshore waters. That's shallow water.
That's also the stuff where we walk and swim and fish. And
Right. And what makes the bay so special, right, is that it's shallow and it's got lots of edges.
So if you focus on shallow areas, what are we doing there that we haven't been doing for the last 25 years?
Well, I think if you you're making water quality investments. And Caesar says a couple things about making those investments. It says, first of all, change the way you express the returns on those investments. Instead of talking about molecules of nitrogen and phosphorus, talk about what people care about.
What's that?
Usually it's living resources, right? Can I fish in it? Can I swim in it? Those types of things. So talk about the returns, assess your returns on that basis. And then it says, make those investments smart. If you make them spatially in shallow waters, you're going to get a much bigger living resource return. That's where the habitat matters. And so focus on those areas. You'll get the water quality benefits to the whole bay, but go there first.
I see a lot of head nodding and agreement here. So Carmela, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, we at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, we're working with the Nansemond Indian Nation, and they are reclaiming some land that they, in Matinat Town, and part of that is reintroduction to the oyster habitat and to fishing habitat. That's part of their cultural experiences and pastimes, and also a part of their culture and their traditions. And just reintroducing those oyster habitats benefit not only the bay and the coastal resiliency, but also the community, because it's a part of their culture and their practice, and also as a part of their living experience and where they live.
And as we noted before, some of the oyster repopulation is it's working.
Yep, that's working.
So I just have to brag on my home watershed, which is the Anacostia River on the east side of Washington, D.C. Historically, it's the side of the city that was redlined, where all the bad stuff went, landfills and power plants and dumping, and a variety of other pollutants. And 20 years ago, it was unimaginable that it would ever come back. But folks leaned in at the community level, at the city level, at the state level, at the utility level. So we're stopping and have stopped much of the combined sewer overflow, so sewage going directly into the water. Nonprofit organizations built trash traps in the little tributaries going in, catching floatable trash, so it's actually hard to find a piece of trash on the Anacostia River. I could go on and on at all the different levels, but the biggest validation, Frank, is not necessarily the model, but is the critters. So we have river otters coming back, we have seagrasses, we have mussels that we never thought would come back that are there. And bald eagles, there's bald eagles everywhere, unimaginable. So that's a real life example that I see every day, and also recreation. So people are fishing there more, they can bike there, they're participating, and they're invested. And that's what we mean by the living resource.
Carl, you're the journalist here. You cover this, the good, the bad, and the disappointing. When we talk about targeting, draw on your knowledge and the work that you've done, what's the kind of targeting that needs to take place going forward? Okay, we're not going to make the goals in 2025, but there's 2026 and 2027 and 2028.
Well, what you would target depends on what results you want. If you want nutrient reductions, you target one place. If you want shallow water improvements, you target other places. And it's kind of like a societal question of, what you really value. You can target really intensive ag areas for your nutrients, but that's going to be a real tough slog, and it's going to be a hard time to show results. And so I would target areas where I thought I would actually see results that people would see quicker.
Such as?
There's a lot of shallow water areas, and a lot of streams. Like I said, there's streams all over that have improved because of actions that were taken on the land. And I think, looking at the number of stream miles that we've improved would be a really effective measure going forward.
David, what would you target? What should we target?
I think, again, it's not a simple answer. It is figuring out what is most effective, like others were talking about, that farmers or anybody else, they don't want to feel like they're just checking off a box. Mm-hmm. We need more. We have probably more information about the Bay than just about anywhere else, but we need more.
Adam, very quickly to you before everybody gets a chance to sort of sum up what we've heard here tonight and where we're going. Is there going to be another target set, another daily load kind of thing like we had for 2025 by the EPA going forward?
Yeah, so we're working on that now, and we're doing it in consultation with dozens of stakeholder groups, as well as all the member states in the District of Columbia and the tribes. So it's looking forward, not just a new date, but really practically how are we going to get there, and how are we going to improve the living resource.
With teeth?
With teeth. But, it's, the federal government, we don't have as much authority necessarily on the Bay. Remember, the Bay was above and beyond, and it's a voluntary agreement beyond the Clean Water Act. So we do what we can. We're enforcing, but, we need the states and the localities to also step up as well.
We've had a very wide-ranging conversation that's just really touched the surface because this is such a deep and complex area. But let me ask you each to take a moment, a sentence or two, if you had to come away from this conversation, come away from the Caesar report, thinking about the future, to tell people what to take away. What would that be? Carl, you want to start us off?
Well, it's a really unsexy answer. It's like, just recognizing that it took a long time to get into the situation that we got into. It's going to take a long time to get out. And we just need to think about making incremental, continuous improvements, learning what works, what doesn't work, apply what we learn, and move forward. If we just set grandiose goals, we're probably setting ourselves up for failure.
Adam.
We're smarter now than we were 40 years ago. We've learned a lot, and we have the benefit not just of so many more people involved, but also better science, better technology, better mapping. So we can be more strategic, and we have to be.
David?
My message is kind of what we've been saying, is you can have an effect on your place. So show up, have your interest represented, and tell people what matters to you and what you want.
Denise?
Writing the Caesar report is probably the most hopeful thing I've ever done.
Really?
There's opportunity everywhere at every scale, from individual to federal. What a fascinating conversation to have about what vitality means for all of us. So dive in.
Carmela, you get the last word.
Awesome. Well, partnerships and relationships. I think we saw with the First Bay Agreement, we're seeing with the Caesar Report, we're seeing with all the work that we're doing together. It's really about building those relationships with one another and building that partnership and collective to build solutions.
A lot of challenges, a lot of opportunities, a lot to do. You've given us a lot of food for thought, so thank you all. You can find extended versions of my conversation with Kyoto and also of our interviews with the Bay Journal's Tim Wheeler and Maryland Secretary of Agriculture Kevin Addix on our website, mpt.org/Bay Summit. Cleaning up the Chesapeake and its watershed will be harder and take longer than most thought when that first Bay Agreement was signed 40 years ago. So tonight we heard a few of the perspectives about what the path to progress might look like and how it could involve all of us, what that route and its destination may be. It's a beautiful and vital resource that we all treasure and we must preserve. Thanks to our panelists, thanks to our partners at the Bay Journal, and to our audience here in the studio, and to you for watching. I'm Frank Sesno from Maryland Public Television. Good night. Does anybody have a 1, 2? Oh, look, we got, yes. Why don't we start right here?
How do we clean up that stormwater before it goes into the bay? Because I know it contains a lot of pollution.
I've got runoff coming out down my yard, and I'm like, what do I do?
The future of the Chesapeake Bay belongs to the future, which is our children. So my question is, we have to start educating them so much earlier. So where's the partnership between the EPA at the federal level and Department of Education